They're having a major memorial service for Charlie Kirk next week. Expecting 60 or 70,000 people. Well, I don't want to devalue your time by wasting your time by not starting class on time, so let's get moving. I looked at the outline and I realized I left out a whole section of material that I didn't get sent to Randy. There's supposed to be 3 parts, and I only have 2 on that sheet you got, but that's okay. The second part you don't need to have probably, though I'm going to cover it. I'm going to tell you a story. Well, let me back up. How many of you have ever actually seen a shepherd working in the field with sheep? Okay, there's a few of you who are familiar with what that looks like. I'm going to tell a story of a shepherd and sheep that I saw in Israel. If you've heard the story, just put up with me. But I want you to be thinking as I'm telling this story about the traits or characteristics of a shepherd that you might think of when you're thinking about shepherds in the church. Now, what characteristics do they have in common? What was Jesus trying to tell us when he said, first, I'm the true shepherd, and then later Peter would talk about the shepherds, and Jesus is the chief shepherd. One of the tragedies of growing older is part of your vocal cords don't keep working, and I found that out from a throat guy, so hang with me. It was about 4:30 in the morning in Jerusalem. We had to get up early to be ready in time for the group breakfast, for we were on a tour of Israel. Our hotel was on the south side of Jerusalem. We were looking over the hills down towards Bethlehem. And I heard this racket outside the window, and I thought, 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, who's doing that? So I had to look. And what I saw, I didn't quite recognize, but I thought I need to get my telephoto lens from my camera and see what's going on out there. Well, I started looking south towards Bethlehem, and there is a connection here. Bethlehem means Beit Lahim. That means house of bread. House of bread was where they grew wheat. And the wheat would be a winter crop, come up, be harvested in the springtime. And then in the summer, the Bedouin shepherds would come up out of the desert and take their flocks to those wheat fields that had been harvested, and they would eat in the coolness of the mountains for the summer into the fall, and then they'd go back down into the desert. This is late July, which is why I'm pretty sure Jesus was born in late July, but we won't go there because that's when the shepherds are up there. So I started looking through the telephoto lens, and I saw a shepherd wearing a blue robe, a Bedouin, amongst a flock of sheep of about 100 or so. Now, why is he yelling at the sheep? And then I realized he wasn't yelling at the sheep. He just wanted to make sure they knew where he was. He was communicating to them with his, what I thought was yelling, but it was just him vocalization for the sheep to hear him. When I first saw him, he was at the back of the flock, but he wasn't driving them. He had just stood there, and the flock had fed by him and was a bit ahead of him. And as I watched, I saw him pick up a rock and throw it, and it bounced right underneath the sheep's nose. I had a good telescopic lens. But he didn't hit the sheep. In fact, what was interesting was the sheep did not respond as though he had just been scared. He knew that the shepherd said, "Get back over here." And sure enough, that sheep moved back over with the flock where he was supposed to be. And then when he started to move, started walking, the sheep coalesced around him like iron filings around a magnet. And he walked amongst the sheep as he was moving forward. He went probably 40 or 50 yards and just stopped. And when he did, he didn't give any instructions. The sheep just spread out, started feeding. And that went on for 30 or 40 minutes. Whenever he moved, they came up around him till he got to where he wanted them to feed, and he would stop and they would spread out and feed. When he came to a wall, a rock wall that had been built across this field, there was an opening in it that didn't have a gate on it, but it was functioning like a gate. When he came to that gate, the sheep part of them were ahead of him just because they were surrounding him, not because he said, "You have to go first." They went through, he walked through, and when he got to the other side of the wall, all that flock of sheep just spread out again and started feeding. It was fascinating. Okay, here's my question. What did you hear in that story that sounds like it could apply to a church? That qualities that Jesus would have used the shepherd as a title to apply to himself. The shepherd was present and the sheep knew it. Yeah. What else?
The sheep recognized the shepherd by his voice.
The sheep recognized the shepherd by his voice. I got to tell you a story. When we were doing the Gospel of John in small group last year, I told this story. My granddad used to call his cows, and they would come up from a mile away down a gully and back up to the top of the hill where he'd feed them hay or cotton seeds or whatever. He would call them. One day I decided to try to imitate him. I'll back up a little bit. This is a facsimile of what my granddad would say. He'd say, "Woo! Woo!" I thought, I can do that. So I saw some cows coming up and decided to do that. And the cows that were already up there with their big brown eyes looked at me. And I don't think cows have this level of intelligence, but they sure look like it because they looked at me. "Who are you, stupid? You didn't put this hay out here for us." And then I recognized that a flock, or the cattle in this case, they get to know the shepherd's voice, so in this case my granddad's voice, because he was with them and they knew when he called there was food coming. What other characteristics did you hear? I wasn't a very good storyteller. What else? Guiding. From where? What position was he in with the flock? He was in the middle all the time. The only times he was not in the middle was when they had moved past him a little bit, and he would move up, and they knew immediately when he was there. What else? Yes. Right. He was with them so much that they were not scared by his yelling voice nor the thrown rock. That was pretty impressive to me. Yes. Right. Some shepherds in some cultures, Basque shepherds who have come over here from Spain, they very often will have a shepherd's crook with the hook on the end of it by which they can get a hold of a sheep by the neck and pull it towards them or whatever they need to do. But it's a form of, I don't really want to use this term, but I am going to use this term. It was a form of controlling, helping, guiding the sheep. What else did you hear in the story? Pardon? He had patience. He wasn't in a hurry. I mean, where were they going to go when they got through here? They were going to go back to the sheepfold that night after they'd been out eating all day. Yes?
There was a kind of silent communication, understanding between them. When he moved and then stopped, they knew, okay, so there's new feed.
Yes.
We need to leave this because there's not.
I'll call that relationship, in that he had such a close relationship with the sheep, and they had developed, now I'm not want to turn sheep into human beings, but the sheep had such a relationship with the shepherd that they trusted him and knew what he was going to do and what he was doing. When he walked forward in the midst of them, we're moving. He didn't tell them that. He didn't pop a whip. They knew because of the relationship. What else did you hear? Pardon?
They trusted that where he led them, they could, after he got delivered to this roast, they didn't have to stay in tight.
That's an outstanding point. They trusted him that he knew where he was going, and so they went with him. I'm going to talk about some elderships in a minute, but one of the things that sometimes happens is the sheep trusted the shepherd that they knew he was going to take them to positive results, water, food. But it also was a sense in which he didn't have to, quote, be there all of the time. They trusted him, he trusted them. I've known of congregations where elders didn't trust the church, where small groups, for instance, were brought up. Let's have small groups. And the elders wouldn't do it because they didn't trust the church, because they had to have control over the congregation, and they didn't want the flock to be mixed up into a bunch of different flocks, which is the antithesis of the shepherd that I just described. What else? Anybody else? Going once, going twice? What I saw in those shepherds was they recognized his voice. They knew him explicitly. They trusted him because he provided them what they needed. He did not lead from the front nor drive them from the back. He was a part of the flock. And we may say, well, how in the world can he be part of the flock if he's the shepherd? Because he was amongst them. Several years ago, I got involved. It was a Sunday night Sunday potluck. And we were setting chairs and tables up and taking them down and so on. And I was doing that. And somebody came up to me, Penny, why are you doing that? And I said, well, I'm a member of the family here. And they said, but you're the preacher. You're not supposed to be doing that. Now, I have eventually realized, I think they were talking about the separation of powers like the apostles and the church. Get some folks to go feed the widows. But I didn't do that. I was amongst the flock. Every church I've ever been in, I set up tables and chairs, except I can't do that anymore here. So if you see me standing around, I'm not just being nice to the flock. I can't do that anymore. But the challenge is to be a member, to be a part of, to be related to the flock. And one other thing that we didn't mention, but I think is very crucial. A shepherd is a servant to the sheep. And in my mind, at least, the shepherd is in submission to the sheep. Anybody want to think what that means? How does that come across to you? That the sheep, yes?
Well, if you read the book of John the way it's supposed to be read, you'll read that Jesus was the good shepherd and the way and the truth and the light. And that's what it actually says in that scripture.
Okay. Jesus was the way, the truth, and the life, and he showed us how to do it. How else do you see a shepherd being in submission to the flock?
He's not going where he wants to go. He's going where he knows the sheep need to be.
He is in submission to their needs. He has to do, and he does it because he wants to. As they had when I was growing up, I went to Camp Blue Haven in the mountains near Las Vegas, New Mexico, And the cabins had to take turn washing dishes. This was pre-dishwasher days. And there was a sign above the big sink that said, "You don't have to wash dishes, you get to." And I used to think, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. But we got to, because we got to be at camp. The shepherd doesn't have to, he gets to. He's in submission to the sheep because their needs precede his. And when they need him, their needs supersede his. Now, yeah, there's a difference between needs and wants. In this case, the shepherd needed the sheep because he was the shepherd and he wanted to take care of them. He gave them his full attention all day long and through the night. In the book, They Smell Like Sheep. I won't encourage you to read that, but there's a section where Lynn Anderson talks about Jesus says that he is the gate for the sheep. And the shepherd would lay down when he got the sheep into the corral, I'll call it. He would lay down across the entrance to that, so no wild animal is coming in over him, and the sheep aren't going out over him either way. He's the gate. And it was as effective as if you'd put a wire or a wooden gate up there. So think about the concept. Submission is the bottom line of Christianity. We submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. That submission may take different forms. Like, the Bible doesn't say, "Husbands, submit to your wives," but Paul begins that text in verse 21 of chapter 5. Be in submission to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then he describes how that submission functions and what it looks like. Wives do this and husbands do this, but they're both in submission to each other. Submission is not who's stronger, larger, louder. Submission is a choice to pay attention to the needs of the other person. Does that make sense? Okay. What I want to do now, you may say it's just the remembrances of an old fogey. But I want to talk about 50 years of working with elderships, as from the perspective of being the preacher, to reflect on. We do not often understand the power of the influence of elders. I've worked with 6 churches in 50 years as the preacher. In that time, and I think this is pretty close, I worked for 17 different elderships. I told Randy that the other day, and he said, "You mean 17 different elders?" I said, "No, 17 different elderships." Because every time there's a change in the eldership, addition or subtraction, you immediately have a new eldership, and I don't like using a new group of shepherds. Eldership sounds like a board of directors. That does not work. But anyway, in working with those men through the years, there were several things that I observed. One of them was, and it was very humiliating to me when I figured this out, preachers only come and step into the history of a church for a few years, long or short, and then he steps out and the history of that church keeps going. When a preacher comes to a church, the first thing he wants to know is, what's the history of this place? Nearly every church I've been in, I went back and read most of the bulletins to find out what's going on in this congregation. Where have they been? Where has the fluctuations in membership and in attendance been? To find out the story. But a preacher's only there for a short time. The elders are there for the life of the church. Now, they may change over time, but they typically do what they've seen done before. That's why what the elders and Randy are proposing we do is such a radical change. And I use that word intentionally. because it's turning the system upside down. And I'll explain that in just a bit. While I worked with those churches, I learned that there's a difference between boards of directors and shepherds. There's one church that this explicitly took place. When I went there, there were 6 elders in a congregation of about 400, 500 people. I never could go to an elders meeting and bring up anything about one of the members without somebody knowing what I was talking about. And I thought, well, why am I doing this? They already know all of this. How did they do that? 2 reasons. One was they were shepherds. They were paying attention to the flock. They knew what was going on in the congregation. And I never found anything going on that they didn't already know about. They were paying attention to the flock. The second part of that was they practiced Acts chapter 7. They had a very well-developed ministry system, is what they called it. That congregation didn't have deacons as we use that. Well, they did. They just didn't use the term. They had ministry leaders. And the ministry leaders took care with their ministry committees of everything happening in the congregation. And so the work was getting done without the elders having to be involved in it. They would check in, and the ministry leaders would let them know what's going on in their ministry as a way for the shepherds to know what's going on in the flock. But it wasn't report, and we'll see whether you're doing your job right or not, and whether we need to remove you or not. It was simply communication of the shepherds with the sheep. There was a man in that group of shepherds named Ben Leverett. Ben Leverett was one of the most outstanding shepherds I ever knew. And I guess one of the reasons had to do with his philosophy was, and he told the rest of the shepherds this, we hired these men to do the job because they have the expertise. We leave them alone and let them do their work. Basically, if they did something immoral or they stole something from the church, well, they'd step in. But other than that, they left us alone. And there were 5 staff members in that congregation. Pulpit, education, youth, evangelism, and children's minister. There were 5 of us. And it went great. They knew the flock. We knew the flock. They supported us. And it went great. Ben Leverett died. And the shepherds became an eldership. A man who came in to take his place was an executive with Texaco, which had a large presence in the area where this took place. The shepherds, now under the influence of this Texaco executive, became a board. And it all fell apart. That congregation, which at one time had 700, is now down to about 200. And except one congregation, that has happened every place I've been. And you may say, well, Penny, you sure left it in a bad shape. Well, I don't want to believe that because I was just there a short time. And I know that there's more to life than numbers, but let me share this with you. Second church I was with had a group of basically functioning shepherds, not as good as later, but they were doing a good job. We had an influence of people who came from the South who were very traditionalists. At that time, that congregation had worship first. We met for worship at 9:30. We dismissed, and we had Bible classes then following at 10:45. That accomplished 2 things. One was I couldn't preach as long as I wanted to. Those little kids want to go to class. Second thing was we had more people attending Bible classes when they came to the assembly first and then Bible classes. Well, the traditionalists came in, and one of those became an elder. and he wanted it changed. We had a very active ministry system. He attended our education meeting. He told the education committee that the elders wanted to reverse the order of worship and Bible study. And then he went to the elders and told the elders that the education committee wanted to change the order of ministry and Bible study. Both of those were false. But because it was a board of directors system, and he had a louder voice than the others, it was reversed. Thankfully, after I left. That church is down to about 200 people now, from 400. The power of the elders is so significant in whether they are a board of directors or whether they are shepherds. The only congregation that, as far as I can tell, was the first one that I was with over 50 years ago. And I will call its name. It's the Cedar Rapids Central Church. Meets on 1st Avenue Northwest. About the time I was leaving there, they did a reaffirmation and an appointment of new elders. There was a man who had been an elder there for several years. He no longer had the characteristics needed of a man to be a shepherd. He was not well thought of by outsiders because his business had to be taken over by the bank. He was such a bad businessman. He knew how to dig dirt, but he didn't know how to take care of his bank account. And of his 5 kids, none of them were Christians. During that reaffirmation process, the church did not reaffirm him. And there was a crisis moment of, they say, we don't support you as a shepherd, and his desire to keep being a shepherd. One of the wise men in the congregation who'd been there forever talked to him and said, this is what the church is saying. He resigned as an elder, stayed in that congregation until he died, about 20 years later. That was the healthiest church because they did it biblically. They did it in a shepherding way, and they functioned as shepherds. They had a ministry system. They had deacons and so on. In fact, I originated the leadership retreat we had at Wapsipinicon State Park, in which we went up there for all day, and the deacons and the elders worked together on what are we doing this coming year and how are we going to do it and who's going to do what. And it worked out great. That church is still a very healthy congregation. 55 years later, 50 years after I left there. Another church no longer exists because of the board of directors. And in fact, this wasn't even a board of directors. This was, we are in charge because we're the elders and we tell you what to do. In fact, the reason I went there was the attendance had started going down because they were transplanted Oklahomans and Texans, and the church had grown just by population increase when Texas and Oklahomans and Arkansasians and others from the Midwest were moving to that area because of the jobs. And so they didn't grow by growth, they grew by transference. And the preacher before me had been there for about 30 years. And attendance started going down, and so he got blamed for it. And so they brought me in to save the church. They didn't say it at the beginning, but eventually that's what it meant. And I couldn't either because they were terrified of their culture around us and did no evangelism, no outreach. In fact, one Sunday a deacon came up to me and said, we're a really friendly church. Look out, just why aren't people coming? We had stopped having visitors. I started keeping a record. We didn't have visitors for 6 months. And I don't know if you believe this or not, but in Revelation it says, I'm going to take your candlestick away. God was keeping the visitors away because God didn't want them to be contaminated by what was going on. And and the deacon said to me, look around, aren't we a friendly church? And I said, come here. And I took him through the back doors and said, look at this. Here was a group, and here was a group, and here was a group, and here was a group. And they did not interact with each other except to say hi. We were a very divided congregation, though we thought we were all on the same page. That church no longer exists. Another church went over a period of years from 700 to 25. Now, why am I telling you those gruesome stories? Another congregation went from 300 to 100 now. Because it comes back to whether men see themselves, and more importantly, whether the church sees the men as shepherds or as boards of directors. And whether the men think more highly of themselves than they ought and think they ought to run the church because they know more and they're more spiritually mature and the church has got to run this way or it won't work. Are y'all getting a picture here? I'm telling these stories because what we're trying to do is to change that model. Turn with me to Matthew chapter 20. In fact, I was debating telling you this or not. I was at one congregation and I had a very close friend who was appointed as an elder. And the day he was appointed, I was glad for him that he had been appointed as an elder. But I was sad for our friendship because it was never the same again. Because preachers are so often viewed as employees. According to the IRS, we're contractors. But we were viewed as employees. I wanted to work as a co-worker with elders all through the years, and I never got past that employer-employee relationship. It all comes down to shepherding. Okay, look at what Jesus said, a famous passage. The mother of James and John said, I want them to be in charge with you. Verse 24, when the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers, which I think means they were mad they didn't think of it first. Jesus called them together and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Look on your handouts. And look at that top pyramid. That's how the Gentiles, that's how the world views organizations. You have the CEO, various manifestations of it, CFO, CEO, president, the guy who owns the company. But it's always the top down in the world. And we so have followed that model that we read what Jesus said here and don't do it. Isn't that interesting? One of the challenges, this is a freebie, put this in a parentheses. One of the challenges of reading the Bible is reading the Bible like it was meant to be read and not like we interpret it. When we look at that description of characteristics, which we will look at later in 1 Timothy about those men who would be shepherds, we apply our own models to that. Very often it's a checklist. Well, can he be an elder if he's got 9 out of 10? Can he be an elder if he has 6 out of 10? Can he be an elder? And what happens if he's not one of those eventually? We are looking at a board of directors model in which we're looking at somebody's resume rather than looking at their character. Does this individual have the character to be a shepherd of the sheep? So the model we've had is top down, and every one of those elderships that I described in my 50 years of history with them they were all top down. Now let me say this. It was not necessarily because they wanted it that way. hear me carefully. I am not blaming elders for that board of directors mentality. That's what we have wanted them to be. So often in those same years, we wanted elders to fix it. We'd go to an elder. This is going on over here. You need to take care of that. And I view that just like a high school principal. Well, like I was as associate dean of students, which is like the assistant principal. I was responsible for all the discipline in the campus. So they'd come to me to go fix it. I remember our first football game played Arizona Christian, believe it or not, was the first football game UTPB ever played. And we had people out there being normal, stupid kids, like they had done in high school, cussing, yelling, criticizing, putting down, trash talking, all of that stuff that took place. And they came to me, the administration heard about that, thought, we can't have kids doing that. And I thought, why not? I'm not sure you're going to change that. But they came to me to fix it. I didn't. Couldn't. But we sometimes have gone to elders and wanted them to be boards of directors for them to solve the problems. The air conditioning's too cold. The heater's not turned high enough. I couldn't get in the building. So-and-so was not nice to me. I called the office and whoever answered the phone must have not been having a very good day and they weren't very nice to me, which means they didn't tell me what I wanted to hear. And they'll go to the elders and say, fix that staff member. Just curiosity. The three elders that are in here, the fourth one is teaching the high school class. Guys, have you ever had people come to you like that? Where they're wanting you to fix it? Yeah. All three of them are saying yes. Unanimous. That doesn't work very well. Primarily because that's not the biblical model. What does the Bible say we're supposed to have if we have a problem with a brother? You go to him. In fact, one of the great gifts that shepherds could have is to say, I understand you have a problem. Let me go with you and let's go talk to the person and take them to see them. That's mentoring, that's modeling, that's equipping in conflict resolution. Let's go talk to them. But the top-down model, in every case but one, in 50 years of which I've been with churches, has failed. You turn that model upside down, and now the point is at the bottom. And who's down there? Servants. Jesus is the chief shepherd because he's the chief servant. You remember when Jesus washed the feet of the disciples? Why do you think Peter was so upset that Jesus did that to him? Pardon? Made Peter look bad? Because he didn't do it first? Pardon? Okay. He was following the way of the world. I mentioned earlier about, as the preacher, I was setting up chairs and tables or cleaning up afterwards, sweeping the floor, I don't remember. Somebody didn't like me doing that. Why? Because the model of the world was the preacher was the top dog. And in many situations, churches think the preacher is the top dog. Let you in a secret. He ain't. Because the elders are. Unless they become shepherds. That's why it is so thrilling to me to see this process take place. Because one, the only model our shepherds have ever seen of elders is as boards of directors. That's their model for the last 100 years. That's the only model they've seen. They have been taught by looking at other elders. That's all they know. So I'm not jumping on their case. And that's all that we have known as a church. We've only known boards of directors. And so we have developed generations of expectations of this is what he does and this is what we do. And Jesus comes along in this text and turns it upside down and said the ones who are the greatest are the ones who are on the bottom who are doing all of the service. And what gets built on service? Other levels of service. And what gets built on those earlier levels of service? Other levels of service. By the time you get to the top of the pyramid, the whole congregation is involved as servants, whether it's at the building, but in the community, with other people, with each other. It's not about who's top dog. I remember in the olden days, prayers were, well, it depended on your particular congregation, whether it was preachers first or elders. Be with our preacher, be with our elders, be with our deacons, be with our Bible class teachers, be with our... Do you hear the hierarchy? Bible class teachers were at the bottom of that quartet of hierarchies. Jesus turns that upside down and says, Bible class teachers are servants.
Sounded like members were at the bottom.
In this case, members are at the top. In the model of Jesus. Yeah, the ways of the world is that the members are at the bottom. That's why the top down doesn't work. Because they told the members what they were supposed to do and what their expectations were. I confess there was one church I was with. They took me to breakfast. 2 elders took me to breakfast. It's never nice to go to breakfast with 2 elders. They said, we want to make a change. I said, okay. About 3 years later, I talked to one of those elders and I said, so how did that work out for you? Because it went from 150 to about 70 in that 2 or 3 years. And Ann and I stayed at that church. A picture that Jesus talked about that's in Ezekiel, Jesus didn't talk about it, it's in Ezekiel, the text that we read last week, in which God is upset because the shepherds have run away from the sheep. In that congregation, when they made that change to see how something else would work, the elders got mad at how things went and left. And one of the ladies said in our small group, our shepherds left and you stayed here. They abandoned the flock. And so the model we're going to be looking at, the 3 things I've talked about this morning is the image of the shepherd, the history of what boards of directors and what shepherds look like in a congregation, and what Jesus said is the model, which is the bottom up rather than the top down model. And when Jesus lived, did he submit to people? Yeah, Jesus submitted to. What's the ultimate sign of submission? To die for somebody. Jesus submitted to us by dying for us to make us free from sin. Shepherds submit to the flock by meeting their needs, knowing where they are, what kind of feed do they need, where can I find pure water, what animals can I keep from coming into the flock and ripping them up. As we go over the next 6 or 7 weeks, keep these principles in mind as we look at every aspect of when they smell like sheep. The only place I've smelled a sheep is at the barn at the fair. And they're always clean and smelling really nice, so I don't know what real sheep smell like. Okay, next week, Randy will be doing his turn. I don't know how we're going to do this, but thanks for coming. And I do want to say, last week, the thing that I wanted to say most of all, I could not believe how many of you were here. And I am thrilled to see this level of attendance because it shows your concern about our congregation. And just from a personal perspective, thank you for that. We'll stop and gather for the assembly.